Imagine the world you know, your home, your community, your everyday life. Then imagine waking up one morning and everything has changed. The streets are deserted, the familiar faces are gone, the shops are closed, and the silence is heavier than fear. Now, imagine this is happening not in one isolated war zone, but in multiple regions across the planet right now. Over 122 million people have been forced from their homes by conflict, violence, and persecution. And yet, for most of them, the world barely notices. This is the story of a displacement crisis so vast, so complex, that it stretches across borders, continents, and climates. A crisis driven by wars some have never heard of, politics many ignore, and silent suffering that rarely makes the front page. Tonight, we peel back the layers so you can see what is hidden, understand how we got here, and decide for yourself why this matters. The latest data from the United Nations unveils a statistic you cannot escape. As of June 2024, over 122 million people worldwide were forcibly displaced. Of those, 72 million remained inside their own countries, driven from home but not across borders. Refugees who did cross international borders numbered over 43 million. These are not just numbers. They represent entire communities uprooted, futures disrupted, and familiar landscapes erased. And here is the part that should wake us up. Many of these displacements happened in places with minimal media coverage, little international attention, and dwindling aid budgets. The UN notes that the number of forcibly displaced people has almost doubled in the last decade. The world has changed, but our awareness has not kept pace. So why don't we see this crisis more clearly? Why are so many uprootings unknown to us? There are three key reasons. Firstly, many of the world's largest displacement events are internal. People are fleeing inside their own country, not crossing borders, and these movements often happen where media can't easily reach. In fact, in 2023, a tracking group reported nearly 76 million people were displaced internally, the highest number ever recorded. Secondly, aid funding and media attention often go to the dramatic visible events, major wars, collapsed states, high drama. But when a crisis is slow, layered, and overlapping with other issues like climate change or food insecurity, it falls off the front page. As The Guardian pointed out, forced displacement has climbed to 123 million globally. Yet many of the worst-hit zones are politically fragile states that are rarely in the headlines. Thirdly, this crisis is deeply intersectional. It blends conflict, climate, food shortages, and structural vulnerability. This blurs the lines of cause and effect, making it harder to report, harder to document, and easier for societies to overlook. But when the problem is everywhere, effective responses are often nowhere. To understand how we arrived here, we must look at the driving forces. These aren't just wars with bombs and bullets. They are also climate breakdowns, economic collapses, and decades of neglect. Let's examine 4 engines of displacement. First, war and territorial conflict. When violent groups seize territory, civilians run. Sudan, for instance, is currently the world's largest internal displacement crisis. When war erupted there in April 2023, entire neighborhoods were emptied. Hospitals, water systems, and markets collapsed within weeks. Another engine is our planet's changing climate. Droughts, floods, and desertification don't always make headlines, but they push people to flee their homes. In just 10 years, climate-related disasters have displaced an estimated 250 million people globally. Then there's the collapse of livelihoods. When farmers have no seed, markets have no trade, and currencies crash, people are forced to leave sometimes more effectively than bullets can. When people cannot earn, eat, or send their children to school, they take the hardest step of all, leaving everything behind. Finally, there's governance failure and forced removal. Sometimes people are simply told to leave, and their homes are destroyed. When multiple crises hit weak states, the result is mass civilian movement. The UN notes that of the newly displaced people in early 2024, 4.7 million were due to conflict, and 90% of them were in just 6 countries: Sudan, Myanmar, DRC, Ukraine, Haiti, and Mozambique. Together, these engines overlap and reinforce one another, creating more displacement than the world is prepared for. But what does this look like for real people? Not statistics, not graphs. Let's step into one story and you'll realize this could happen anywhere. A woman named Amina once lived in a village on the edge of a forest. The market was 20 minutes away. Her children went to school. She harvested crops. Her neighbors were like family. Then one morning, distant gunfire. Her husband told her, "We go now." They left everything. The roof, the fields, the animals. Just the clothes they had on. They walked for days. At one point, her children cried, "Will we go back?" She didn't know. She found shelter in a camp. There, the tents were full. The water pump broke. The line for food stretched for hours. She heard that many families were returning home, but she decided to stay nearby because home had become unsafe. This is one story among millions. And behind each story is a network of loss, identity, security, community, and history. While displacement happens everywhere, a few regions dominate the scale. For example, by mid-2024, more than 10 million people were internally displaced in Sudan alone, making it one of the largest single-country crises. Millions more are fleeing from Afghanistan, Ukraine, the DRC, and Myanmar. Yet when you look at a world map, the displaced often move to the least expected places: border deserts, isolated settlements, and remote camps far from cameras. This geography of invisibility ensures that large swaths of displacement remain out of sight and out of mind. You might be asking, why should I care if she left her home, if he became displaced in a remote country? Here's why. Because this crisis reshapes our world. When millions move, everything changes. Trade routes shift, remittances falter, markets collapse, and borders strain. And when the most vulnerable flee, we all risk losing stability, affecting global supply chains, migration pressures, and social trust. As one expert put it, these are not cold statistics. These are families forced to flee their homes, carrying next to nothing and searching for water, food, and shelter. In short, the tide of displacement has reached a size and scale that can no longer be ignored. It touches us all, even if we don't see it. But here's where the story gets even more complex. Many think of displacement as a single event of flight from war. The reality is far more layered. It's not one war, one country, or one movement. It's conflict pushing people out, climate forcing them onward, jobs disappearing, and states weakening. It's cycles of displacement. People move, come back, and are forced to move again. The UNHCR calls these protracted displacement situations. For instance, a person might flee fighting in one region, only to arrive at a camp and face drought and malnutrition, forcing them to move yet again. This cycle shears away the very concept of home entirely. This unseen tide is not just rising. It's reshaping our world in ways we are only beginning to understand. If the numbers shocked you, the truth behind them will disturb you even more. Because mass displacement does not happen by accident. It is driven, shaped, and sustained by forces far larger than the people caught inside it. The world sees refugees as victims of chaos, sudden violence, natural disasters, collapsing governments. But what if displacement is also a system? What if whole regions move not simply because explosions tear apart cities, but because the world profits politically, economically, and strategically from keeping people on the run? Tonight, we step into the machinery. Conflict is always quoted as the reason. It is always the front page label. But behind every battle, someone supplies the weapons. Someone funds the factions. Someone gains from instability. When a nation collapses into war, the first price paid is human life. But the biggest profits emerge in bank accounts thousands of miles away. The modern displacement crisis follows a pattern. War begins, civilians flee, infrastructure collapses, humanitarian dependence rises, and foreign interests enter. Look at recent conflicts: Sudan, Syria, Yemen, Ukraine, Myanmar, DRC. Behind every conflict lies a web of arms deals, geopolitical advantage, and regional power struggles. While refugees carry backpacks with nothing inside, the war economy trades in billions of dollars. Arms Watch once reported that weapons worth millions have been moved into conflict zones through complex supply chains involving multiple countries and private contractors. And wherever weapons pour in, displacement follows. When neighborhoods turn into battlegrounds, people have no choice but to leave. The world sees people running. But behind the smoke, someone is cashing a check. It sounds shocking, but humanitarian emergencies themselves can become industries. When millions of people are forced to flee, the global aid system activates UN agencies, NGOs, supply chains, logistics companies, import networks, Construction contracts, camp management organizations, and private security firms. Supplies move. Money flows. Budgets expand. Economies form around suffering. Every refugee camp operates like a city, with its own economy, trade, power, scarcity, and hierarchy. And wherever there is scarcity, there is someone who controls it. Food distribution, medical supplies, water access, shelter materials, everything becomes currency. The bigger the camp, the more control power brokers can exert. And the longer displacement lasts, the more the system grows around it. Many displaced families say the same thing. We are not allowed to go home, they need us in the camp. Because when the displaced return home, the funding ends. So the crisis cycles, people flee, camps grow, dependency increases, and return becomes impossible. Displacement is no longer temporary. It has become permanent survival. When displacement crosses borders, a new war begins, a silent war fought not with tanks, but with policies, fences, and patrols. Countries facing incoming refugees respond in two ways: humanitarian welcome or fortified resistance. And increasingly, the second response is winning. Border walls rise. Visa restrictions tighten. Detention centers expand. Security budgets surge. Every border becomes a negotiation of power. Who may enter? Who may remain? Who may be turned back? Borders today are not lines on a map. They are gates locked or open depending on interests, alliances, and economics. A displaced family reaching a border faces a decision made not by compassion, but by geopolitics. Some are accepted to win international favor. Some are rejected to protect internal politics. Some are trapped in limbo, unable to return, unable to advance. The result: displacement becomes stagnation. Where legitimate systems fail, underground systems rise. In every major displacement crisis, smuggling networks, human trafficking rings, and illegal transportation brokers appear from the shadows. They promise escape, safety, a new life. What they deliver is danger, exploitation, and death. People pay their life savings for boat crossings across the Mediterranean. Trucks smuggle families through mountains and deserts. Forged documents circulate like currency. Women and children vanish. And each step is fueled by desperation, a desperation engineered by war, famine, climate collapse, and political abandonment. When the world closes its doors, the shadows open theirs, and the price is always human dignity. War pushes people out suddenly. Climate displacement pushes them slowly, invisibly. When rivers disappear, people move. When farmland turns to dust, people move. When storms erase coastlines, people move. Rising sea levels threaten to consume entire villages. Changing rainfall patterns destroy agriculture. Floods sweep through communities who have nowhere else to go. Climate displacement does not explode like a bomb. It spreads like a drought unnoticed until it's irreversible. By the time people flee climate disasters, they are already late. They are running from a future that has arrived too soon, and while they run, the world debates statistics. Why is the displacement crisis not front-page news every day? Why does the world not respond with urgency? 3 reasons. First, people displaced internally are largely invisible. No border crossed. No headline. Second, governments avoid attention. Admitting a displacement crisis is admitting failure. And third, the world is busy. Global attention moves faster than suffering. Today, information overload hides reality. One crisis breaks, another replaces it, and the previous one disappears from our screens. In silence, suffering grows. In darkness, systems thrive. And the world continues forward, untouched, unchanged, unaware. Behind the numbers and the politics lie moments that define the human spirit. A family walking for days. A child sleeping on cold cement. A father selling everything for a chance to live. A mother choosing which child to carry first. Home becomes a memory. The future becomes uncertainty. Life becomes waiting. The world's largest displacement crisis is not just movement. It is the slow erasure of identity, belonging, and hope. And yet, people endure. They build tents into communities. They rebuild schools. They keep dreaming. Because hope is the only thing no one has managed to take away. So here are the questions buried beneath the crisis. Who benefits when millions are displaced? Who profits from war? Who gains from aid dependency? Who controls the borders? Who controls the narrative? And the most important question of all, Who loses when the world finally pays attention? Because attention changes everything, and not everyone wants change. The world says displacement is tragedy. But tragedy has become someone's strategy. If displacement is a system, who built it? And what will happen when the system begins to crack? The shadows lengthen. When millions have nowhere left to go, the crisis writes itself in footprints on the dust. But what happens when the world watches, records the numbers, and still acts as if nothing has changed? The global tally is staggering. According to the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, by mid-2025, more than 122 million people had been forcibly displaced worldwide due to conflict, violence, and persecution. Of those, over 83 million were displaced within their own countries by the end of 2024. This isn't just a number. It's a storm that sweeps across continents but gets stopped at borders, paused by politics, buried by distraction. An ocean of promises, a lifeline for millions. Yet for many, it arrives too late or never at all. The numbers may rise, the trucks might roll, but somewhere the system fails. Humanitarian agencies deploy food, shelter, and medicines. But every delivery faces new obstacles: looting, security risks, blocked roads, and destroyed infrastructure. In some displacement-heavy countries, the gap between need and delivery is vast. Funding shortfalls grow. According to humanitarian analyses, by 2025, more than $47 billion would be needed to support over 300 million people globally who depend on aid, but funding remained far below that target. In such conditions, camps become permanent, not transitional. Dependency becomes the norm. When the food truck doesn't come, when the water pump fails, when hope is rationed, people move again, and the cycle spins on. You cannot click what you do not see. And in the world of displacement, invisibility is the deadliest weapon. Media coverage drives awareness. Awareness drives action. But most displacement crises occur in hard-to-reach zones, war-torn regions, internal conflicts, remote landscapes. A recent global report highlighted that forced displacement has almost doubled in the past decade, yet many of the most affected countries receive minimal media attention. This invisibility amplifies suffering. A crisis ignored becomes entrenched. When the cameraman leaves, the story continues. When the headline fades, the pain grows. In camps that accumulate years, children grow up without knowing the home they left. Parents carry trauma, but the world's timeline moves on. Home is not a place you flee from once. It is a place you may never return to again. Some displaced populations do return home. Others find their homes destroyed, their towns erased. In many war-torn countries, the hope of return fades. The UN calls many displacement situations protracted, meaning they last for years, even decades. In these circumstances, the idea of return becomes fiction. When return is impossible, new patterns emerge. Informal settlements, secondary migration, perpetual camp life. A geographer once said, "Displacement becomes geography." Where once we called places home, we begin to call them sites. Where once we were citizens, we become statistics. Conflict used to mean a front line. Now the front line is your livelihood, your water, your school, your roof. And even when the guns fall silent, the damage continues. In displaced communities, the infrastructure is broken. Roads, schools, and hospitals are all compromised. A 2024 report estimated that in some war-torn regions, 80% of health facilities were non-operational. Diseases surge. Malnutrition wins silent battles. In one region overwhelmed by displacement, an outbreak of cholera alone caused hundreds of thousands of cases translated, thousands of lives lost beyond bullets. War detonates the bombs. Displacement spreads the aftershock. And for many, the quiet danger is worse. No shelling, but no schooling. No fighting, but no future. One displacement camp may be thousands of miles away, yet its effect ripples through the world. Forced migration affects more than the borders crossed. It alters demographics, strains infrastructure in neighboring states, disrupts economies, tests social cohesion, and demands international policy. Refugee hosting can shift from a moral duty to geopolitical leverage. Countries may offer refuge or block it, based on regional alliances, resource exchange, or domestic politics. When the world defines welcome, support, and refuge, these are not natural laws, they are decisions. And those decisions determine who stays a citizen and who becomes a displaced statistic. Economies in exile develop. Diasporas rebuild themselves, but their home remains at war or uninhabitable. Remittances flow, camps fill, aid budgets manage. Yet governance rarely reforms. In the darkest places, light still flickers. Where one tent stands, another is built. Where schooling ends, a teacher opens a makeshift class. Where aid fails, communities rise. Displaced people are not just victims. They are also survivors, innovators, teachers, mothers, fathers, and children carrying a future in their backpacks. One displaced group in a remote region formed a self-help cooperative, organizing water delivery, establishing informal markets, and training youth. Such acts are small, tiny in scale, but they matter. Hope is not a headline. It is a seed in broken soil. Every wave of displacement hits a threshold. A number, a moment, a decision. When the system breaks, when the machinery of forced movement cannot sustain itself, change becomes possible. The world can respond not by pity, but by power, policy, dollars, infrastructure, and rights. It can stop treating displacement as an outcome and start dealing with it as a preventable sequence. When we acknowledge the system, its drivers, and its profits, we cannot then ignore it. The crisis is global. Machinery is hidden. The choice is ours. If we watch quietly, the numbers will keep rising. If we act boldly, perhaps the tide can shift. We stand now at the edge of the storm. A world where displacement is no longer just a humanitarian crisis, it is a global system. A system built on conflict, power, resources, greed, silence, and the most dangerous weapon of all, forgetting. Because the greatest tragedy is not just the suffering. The greatest tragedy is how easily the world moves on. For decades, displacement was viewed as temporary, something that would end when peace returned. But peace has become a myth in many regions. Conflicts drag on for years. Millions wait in limbo. Generations inherit exile. The world now faces a truth many leaders avoid saying aloud. Forced displacement has become permanent. It is no longer the result of a crisis, it is the crisis itself. So who benefits when people lose their homes? When millions flee, someone always profits. Behind every crisis, there is gain. Behind every humanitarian disaster, there is a market. War is expensive. War destroys. But war is also business. Weapons are produced, purchased, transported. Contracts are signed. Aid becomes a multi-billion-dollar economy. Foreign governments compete for influence. Private companies fight for control of minerals, oil, and land in broken nations. And while lives collapse, others rise with wealth. For many global actors, displacement is not a tragedy, it is an opportunity. When peace is cheaper than conflict, peace happens. When conflict is profitable, war becomes endless. Then there's the digital war, where information is ammunition. Information shapes reality. Whoever controls the narrative controls the world. Sometimes displacement receives global media attention, headlines, breaking news, dramatic coverage. But eventually, the screens change, the story fades. The world scrolls on, and in that silence, suffering expands. People stop caring when they stop seeing. And when nobody sees, nobody questions. That is how crises survive through silence. Networks of misinformation create confusion, facts blur, numbers compete with opinions. People debate instead of acting. The victims vanish behind arguments. And for those still fleeing, silence becomes another border. If war destroys the present, displacement destroys the future. Half of the world's displaced population are children. Children raised not in homes, but in tents. Not in classrooms, but in waiting lines. Not with dreams, but with trauma. They learn to run before they learn to read. They learn fear before they learn life. Whole generations grow up without identity documents, without education, without safety. They inherit instability, uncertainty, and loss. When a child grows up without a home, the world loses more than a citizen. It loses a future. And the struggle doesn't end when borders are crossed. The body arrives, but the mind remains in the rubble. Trauma follows like a shadow. The loss of family, homes, identity, dignity, and hope. Mental health crises rise drastically. Depression, anxiety, and PTSD become silent epidemics. Yet in many camps, psychological support simply does not exist. Wounds of the body may heal, but wounds of memory bleed forever. So can the world change this system? The question isn't whether we can help. The question is whether we will. Solutions aren't impossible. They just require courage and priority. Real solutions the world must choose. Stop fueling conflicts instead of managing them. Protect civilians, not political agendas. Invest in education and rebuilding, not endless aid dependency. Demand transparency in humanitarian funding. Give displaced people rights, not temporary pity. Build long-term peace, not short-term headlines. But change never begins in buildings of power. It begins with awareness. It begins with people who refuse to look away. Ignoring this problem has become dangerous. The crisis will not stay distant. No border is strong enough to stop desperation. No wall is high enough to stop hunger. When millions lose everything, borders tighten, economies strain, societies polarize, extremism rises, and nations destabilize, a problem ignored becomes a problem shared. This crisis is not their crisis, it is everyone's crisis. Humanity has reached a crossroads. We can continue watching displacement multiply until the world becomes a map of camps, or we can demand justice, prevention, peace, and truth. Either we learn or we collapse. Because the world cannot survive if millions are left without a future. The solution begins when the world refuses silence. The crisis is real, the suffering is real. The displacement is real, and the silence is real. But silence ends when someone speaks. Awareness begins when someone listens. And change begins when someone cares. The question now is not what will happen next. The question is, what will we do now that we know the truth? If you believe the world deserves the truth, share this video. If you want more hidden global stories exposed, subscribe and turn on notifications. Your one comment can amplify a voice that has been silenced for years. Comment below. Should the world intervene or stay silent? Do you believe displacement is a humanitarian issue or the result of global power struggles? Who should be held responsible and who should act first? Your opinion matters. Your voice matters. Thank you for watching.